Hi, I'm Isaac Stonefish, and very excited to have Michael Abramowitz, the president of Freedom House, here for our third installation of a really fascinating series we've been doing, the China Boundaries series, with the Carnegie Council, where we debate questions of, with China, where do you draw the line? And today, the question is with nonprofits. And Michael's really the ideal person to be having this conversation with me. Very excited to be joined with him. And he and I were talking about what's a good place to start this and thought about a trip that Michael had to Beijing when he was a journalist with the Washington Post in 2008 for the Olympics, and an interview he had with former President Bush Sr. while he was there. So, Michael, would love to have you start us out there and talk about where things were in 2008 with US perceptions on China as a way of talking about where things have gotten to now.
Sure. Well, thank you, Isaac, and it's really great to be with you. And thank you for inviting me on this webinar. I really appreciate it. 2008 was only 14 years ago, but in some ways it feels like 100 years ago, doesn't it, with respect to U.S.-China relations. At the time, I was a journalist for the Washington Post, where I was before I moved into the nonprofit sector, and now as president of Freedom House. I was the White House correspondent for the Post at the time. And in 2008, President Bush went to the Olympics in person to represent the United States at the opening of the games in 2008. And he attended a number of events, including the Dream Team US basketball team contest against China, I believe. And it was President Bush, there was a lot of debate in the administration, or there's some debate about whether the United States should even attend the Olympics, given China's poor human rights record. But President Bush was pretty clear that he wanted to go, and that he thought that China was really moving in a very positive direction, and he wanted to kind of recognize that by attending the games in person. I think you can debate that in retrospect, but I think at the time it might have been a reasonable thing to do. Because at the time, China was opening up. It was moving in a positive direction. It wasn't a liberal democracy by any means, but it was beginning to be more greatly integrated with the global economy. And I think what we've seen in the past 14 years has been really a dramatic reversal of that situation. And we can go into that. But I think at the time, I think it was sort of a reasonable decision for the president to make.
So let's talk about what has changed since then, especially how things have been for the last several years. How do you contextualize where China is in terms of the ways that various institutions, nonprofits have the ability to engage with it?
Well, first of all, let me just say that I'm not a China expert. I run a human rights organization for whom China is a very major topic of concern, and I have a great set of colleagues who work on China. But I think your listeners should know, first of all, a bit about Freedom House. I'm guessing some people do, but we're an organization that is both kind of a think tank and a do tank. That we're probably best known for our assessments of political rights and civil liberties in every country in the world. Every year for the past 50 years, we've released something called Freedom in the World, which is an assessment of the state of freedom in every country in the world. And we also do other things we can get into. But our first engagement and interest in China really comes from Freedom in the World. And I think what's very interesting is that from a very low base, China has really deteriorated in terms of its respect for political rights and civil liberties under President Xi. In 2011 or 12, when we looked at China, China scored 17 on a global scale of 0 to 100, which is a pretty low bar. But as I said, there was some reason to think that China was moving in a better direction. Since then, freedom has really deteriorated in China. So when we last did Freedom of the World just a few months ago in February, China scored 17. I'm sorry, scored 9 out of on a scale of 0 to 100. So that's an almost 50% drop from a very low base. So things like freedom of the media, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, transparency, rule of law, all these areas are areas that we look at and which China has been deteriorating under President Xi Jinping. So it's really one of the least free countries in the world from the point of view of human rights.
One of the reasons I wanted to have you on this is because it feels like in the question of how do nonprofits work on China, most people just come to the conclusion, well, China can't be ignored, therefore we have to try to be in China. Whereas I feel like part of what you guys do is China can't be ignored, therefore let us continue to do very critical research on China, but not necessarily in China. And can you talk about how Freedom House manages with all of the external pressures and all of the external stakeholders who are, frankly, afraid of offending Beijing and offending the Chinese Communist Party? How do you keep your organization separate and away from those issues, or how do you manage those trade-offs?
Right. Well, you said something at the beginning, Isaac, which I just wanted to emphasize. We don't work inside China. I am personally have been banned from China essentially, and my organization has been banned. We were sanctioned officially by the Chinese government a couple of years ago. So even if we wanted to, we would not be able to work inside China. And I do think that if we worked inside China, it would make it very dangerous for anyone who wanted to work with us. So I just wanted to say that up front. That said, you can work on China. And I do think from the numbers that I said, Isaac, that China is one of the most serious questions for those of us in the world who care about human rights and freedom. I mean, it's not just what's happening in Xinjiang province. It's not just happening in Hong Kong. It's not just threats to Taiwan, but it's also, the threats to things like religious liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of thought inside China. And I would say the increasing propensity of the Chinese government to try to kind of export its version of repression and of repression, really. So we did a report. We've done several reports on an issue called transnational repression. We call it transnational repression. And this is where authoritarian governments like China, like Russia, like Saudi Arabia, not only limit human rights within their borders, but they are increasingly trying to shape the external environment and in some cases repress people who have fled the country to essentially free countries. So if you think just about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in a Turkish consulate a few years ago by the Saudi government, that kind of practice has gone kind of global. And China, we found, is one of the half a dozen most serious violators of what we call transnational repression, where they are intimidating, harassing, surveilling, in some cases rendering back to their own country people who are their critics in exile. So it's really what's happening in China is not just staying in China anymore, it's being exported. And that's something that we're very concerned about. And I think for any group, whether it's a business, whether it's a nonprofit, whether it's a university, whether it's an NBA team, that you have to understand that now about working inside China, that you are going to expose yourself to certain risks that you might not have exposed yourself to maybe 10 to 15 years ago. I'm not here to tell anyone how to run their own business or how to run their own nonprofit. I just think people need to be aware of the risks now of working with China that I think are not the same as they were 15 or 20 years ago.
I think that's really well said. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts on your sense of where the nonprofit community is vis-a-vis China. So there's this sense in DC, it's a sense among some communities in the United States that they're really growing more aware of how China has changed and how the US-China relationship has changed, especially with the genocide in Xinjiang and further digital repression in China. But Hollywood, I would argue, is not there. Wall Street is not there. And I'd love for you to take the temperature of the nonprofit world. Folks that you talk to, what's your sense of where they are on China?
Sure. Well, I do think, Isaac, that there is growing awareness of the risks and challenges of working with China. I think you have to have your head in a rock or in a cave somewhere to not be aware of that. Like, I'm part of the human rights community, the democracy community, so we are perhaps most aware of that. And it's very, we have to be extremely cautious about engaging with China. I'm always constantly worried about cyber risks to my organization and things like that. So I think the human rights community is very well aware of what the kind of challenges are of working with China. Groups like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, ourselves, National Democratic Institute, International Republic Institute. I mean, this is a major issue now for anyone who cares about human rights, and I think we all kind of recognize how challenging it is. I think maybe the more interesting issues now involve other types of nonprofits. So, for instance, universities or other organizations that for whom human rights may not be the major issue, but they're interested in cultural exchanges or things like that. And I think Isaac, and you and I have been involved in some of those conversations. I think there's a growing awareness of the challenges there. I've been, by being the head of Freedom House, I've ended up speaking on varying college campuses over the last number of years. I get invited, and in talking to professors and administrators at some of these universities, I think there is a widespread appreciation of the challenges and what had maybe 10 to 15 years ago been an easier call. Yeah, we're going to set up a campus in this city or that city. I think people are now recognizing that there's more challenges that are associated with that.
So I'm going to ask you a question that I myself don't know the answer to, and it's something I debate a lot. But are there situations where you feel like it's ethical for a global nonprofit to maintain a China office or China presence or a China branch campus?
Isaac, I can't, there's not a one size fits all answer to your question. There's no question that in some cases, there is value that comes from these kinds of presences, from these kinds of relationships, but they also come with a cost. Like, the way I think about it is that there are sort of maybe two basic issues that you have to think about for any nonprofit. One would be, what's your theory of change? What's your goal with China itself? Can you help contribute to positive change, educational, social, other changes? And I think we have to recognize that that's possible, although I do think we have to be very humble about the ability of outsiders to have much influence on a country of close to 2 billion people that has done very well for itself economically. That I think we have to be very humble about ability to influence events there. I think the second, though, area that where I'm personally concerned about is what does our values, citizens of America or citizens of the world. In America, for instance, we have very strong protection of the First Amendment, of free speech rights, through the First Amendment. To what extent are American institutions going to have to give up, the right to criticize, which could be part of the situation if you engage with China in a certain way. if you open up an office and you start talking about history or things in a way that's different than the Chinese government is comfortable with, you may find yourself faced with the question, well, the price of you staying is you shutting up on those issues that are kind of core to your values. So I think different people are going to answer a question different way. I mean, we are a freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom organization. So we're going to answer that question a certain way. Others may have other objectives.
I like that. I think that's really nicely said. And I think one of my frustrations with nonprofits in China is that they're not upfront about the trade-offs that they're making, and they sometimes mislead their stakeholders. So, universities, for example, NYU about 5, 6 years ago, one of their, I think it was a vice dean, said, we're having a campus in China and we're going to uphold the same values of freedom of speech that we do in New York. That's false. That's just not possible in China. I would support an institution there that says, listen, we can't keep the same level of freedom of speech because of Chinese laws, because of Chinese norms. Our campus is going to be very heavily censored and very heavily monitored. Do we like that? No. Do we feel like that is a sacrifice we must take so that people can have access and exposure to China? Yes. So I think I worry sometimes the way that nonprofits and academic institutions engage with China is that they make people think that China is different than it actually is, or that you can do these things and keep your values. You can't. Doesn't mean you shouldn't necessarily be there. I think there's a lot of great arguments for being there, but I think we have to be upfront about those issues. I
And I
wanted to
think
bring
that was
up
very
something.
well
Oh,
said.
please, yeah.
It's very well said, Isaac, and I agree with you. I think just being honest with what the situation is, that if you work in China or have people inside China, you will not have the same kind of ability to be open and honest and critical as you would normally.
And I think that's a good segue to Wall Street and the business community and the question of, when you started out talking to me here and described yourself as a human rights organization, I think for our listeners who are familiar with China, organizations that explicitly describe themselves as human rights organizations tend to have more problems in China because of the way that the Communist Party likes to view those terms. And I'm wondering, what can we do and what can listeners to this event do to make it so that Wall Street, big businesses, your quote unquote average American can very freely support organizations like yours without being afraid of reprisal from Beijing?
It's a great question, and I think just to sort of make explicit what you sort of are making implicit, I do think that there is a huge amount of global money and US money that is now parked inside China. And I think that that's a reality. And I think it makes certain firms, I'm not going to name names or stuff, nervous about supporting groups like Freedom House. I mean, there's some that do, but it's a complicating factor. I think the larger issue which you would like to just sort of address is, I do think that there's been this movement towards ESG, kind of more responsible investment. And I think a lot of concerns of American businesses have really revolved around environmental standards, sustainable development, governance questions, of having a widespread, having an adequate representation of racial diversity. I think the issue that I think is going to come increasingly front and center for American companies and companies is, what are the risks of investing in authoritarian countries? Are your investments going to be treated fairly? Is there going to be a rule of law that's going to uphold this? I think that's a question that I think businesses have to really think carefully about. We've had a great real life example of this, I think, over the last 4 or 5 months with the fallout from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which saw really a wholesale flight of capital, of Western capital from Russia because of the invasion. I think people with big companies, I think Russia has not been the kind of gravy train for businesses that China has been, but I think there have been investments there. But I think people are now realizing that there is a risk to having this kind of presence in authoritarian settings. And I think, you've had a situation in China where, and I don't know all the details, but we haven't heard too much from Jack Ma in the last year or two. And he's someone who was one of the most successful entrepreneurs in China. We don't know exactly what's going on with this company, but I think the point is that as problematic as sometimes in our own countries in the West, I think I think businesses are coming to realize there's problems potentially with their investments in China and Russia and other authoritarian settings.
So just a reminder to those listening that you can send in questions that you want me to ask Mike into the chat, and we'll turn to those in a bit. But I think you brought up a lot of really good points there, and I'm glad you brought up ESG, environmental social governance, which is this relatively new idea of corporate social responsibility, of companies acting in the better interest of the global or the American good. And it's really butt up against people's perception of China. And I'd say it's one of the main reasons that a lot of people don't want to use a swear word, but let's just say that people denigrate ESG in the investment space. And I run a research company, and one of the reasons why I say that I founded the company was because I got frustrated with the ESG space, where a company like Hikvision could have good climate policies or good gender diversity among its senior staff, but make surveillance cameras for concentration camps and still have a high ESG score. And I think this brings up really important issues about where corporate America is going. And we've seen that with activism after the Roe v. Wade overturning. We've seen that with the Trump administration. And then we've seen a lot of people in the Republican Party be quite frustrated at companies like Disney, which have values that they're trying to implement in the United States, and then partner very closely with the Chinese Communist Party in China in ways that allows for very gleeful denunciations of hypocrisy.
Yes, no, you said it very well. I'm not sure what did I hear the question in there?
Oh no, that was a statement. Pause, seeing if there was a response, and then my question is: we're in a world, there's a pretty decent sized intersection between the nonprofit world and the government world, and people will say, "Oh, well, the China debate is the one true area of bipartisan concern." Obviously, it's a lot more complicated than that, and I'm wondering, for someone who's been in the DC area for quite some time, if you could untangle that for folks and walk through your perception of bipartisanship or partisanship in the China issues, especially as it relates to nonprofits.
Well, I certainly look. I've been in Washington for a long time. I'm in the swamp, so to speak. So, I was a reporter here, and then I have had different jobs in the nonprofit sector, and now being head of Freedom House. I think to me, there's no question that there is, much greater suspicion and hostility, potential perhaps towards China than there would have been maybe 10 to 15 years ago. When I was at the Washington Post, I very much remember covering or being involved in the Washington Post coverage of the decision to allow China to come into the WTO. And there really was sort of not everybody, but there was kind of a consensus that was the right thing to do, that China was opening up, that we would, that China would benefit and would grow more liberal, maybe not become a liberal democracy, with greater integration with the world economy. And that has really not proved to be the case. And I do think that you find more common cause about China. You see people, like, on the one hand, Nancy Pelosi, who's one of the fiercest opponents of China or defenders of human rights on China, critics of the Chinese government, but also people like Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell and Marco Rubio. So that's an interesting. I think there is a very much of a bipartisan concern about China's human rights practices. I think also increasingly a bipartisan concern about China's economic practices. I do think there's probably less discontinuity between the Trump administration and the Biden administration on China relative to other issues. I'm still struck that, at his confirmation hearing, that the Secretary of State was asked point blank, "Hey, do you think a genocide is taking place in Xinjiang?" And he said yes, which was there had just been a similar finding from Pompeo. So I do think that you have a growing kind of bipartisan understanding about the threats from China, about the human rights abuses, about China's belligerent behavior in other countries. I think that is certainly something that people, I think, of both parties recognize. I think where we are perhaps struggling is like what to do about it, right? I mean, China is still the biggest, the second biggest economy in the world. Could probably overtake the U.S. at some point. China is still very important to dealing with, substantial global challenges like climate change. So really, the question is, how can you, engage China, but also, stand up for your values at the same time? I think you can do both. I think we showed during the Cold War that we were able to do that with respect to Russia, the Soviet Empire. So I think we're going to have to think about how to do that today.
On that question, which I think you framed very nicely, Carnegie is an ethics organization, and I'd love to hear from you with your leadership at Freedom House hat on how do you deal with these issues ethically, and what are some of the ethical minefields that your organization or other organizations face when thinking about the China question?
For us, I don't think they're really major, to be honest, Isaac, major ethical challenges. I think we're pretty clear about how we feel about what's happening in human rights in China. We've not shied away from that. We've been very clear about that. I think, like, we do think about, making sure that our involvement or our partnership with groups do not make life difficult for them. That's something that I think about. I do have to, people have to be able to make their own judgments about who they're going to work with. And I would acknowledge that for some people, a partnership with Freedom House might present some problems. And I respect that. I think you start from a proposition of do no harm. So you want to do anything you can to do no harm.
You mentioned that organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty have handled these issues gracefully. Are there other organizations, and I think I tend to, push on the negative, but I think we can celebrate folks as well. So are there other organizations or individuals that you feel like have handled these ethical challenges with grace or integrity?
Well, they're not really an organization, but I really, I happened to be in Lithuania recently. I was in Eastern Europe because, Freedom House also has a lot of work and interest in what's happening in Eastern Europe. And it's very interesting. The Lithuanian government welcomed an office from Taiwan in Vilnius, really at great personal cost or great economic cost to Lithuania. They've lost pretty much all their, it wasn't a huge amount of money, but it was not insignificant. And they've lost, and so I admire Lithuania for kind of standing up for its values very much with respect to its foreign policy. I also think about the Women's Tennis Association, which very bravely, I thought, put its own business in China at risk by speaking out very forcefully about the threats to the prominent women's tennis player. I'm not a big tennis fan, so I'm blanking on her name right now, but that got a lot of attention 4 or 5 months ago. So I think there are countries, institutions, groups that can stand up for their values and continue to do their work. I think it's better that all of us do that, so that I think what the Chinese do is kind of pick off some of us, so they will go after a specific company and try to make an example of them and try to keep other companies lying. But if everybody said, hey, we are going to not police the free speech rights of our employees, they can say what they want. I mean, we're happy to work in China, but you got to know that if we're going to work in China, we're not going to tell our employees on their own time not to say what they want to say about human rights in China. I think that would be a great thing for corporate America to do.
I think that's really nicely said. And I think it's funny, whenever we plan as an organization, you make these plans and then reality happens and scoffs at your plans. And sometimes it's helpful and sometimes it's not. And I wonder where for Freedom House, the Russian invasion changed both how the organization functions or reacts in general, and also changed your perception of China, if in any way.
Well, I wouldn't say that it's really changed things appreciably. I mean, I think we have been well aware at Freedom House, because we've been tracking it for quite some time, kind of the kind of authoritarian resurgence. I mean, so just for background, we've been tracking this for 50 years, and every year for the past 16 years, there are more countries that are less respecting human rights and civil liberties than those that respect them. So we're quite concerned about that general trend. I think with Russia, I think it kind of, not that we had blinders on or rose-colored glasses, but I think it's hard to look at Russia now and to think that they are going to change their behavior. I mean, over the last 20 years, they've intervened very bloodily in Syria. They've grabbed the Crimea. They've invaded Georgia. Now the Ukraine invasion. So there's been a hope that one could engage Russia, and I think that hope is kind of dissipated. I guess the big question with China is what they plan to do on Taiwan. And you and I have talked about that some over the last few months. I would be quite worried about a military invasion by China at some point, because I think that President Xi has kind of made it clear that he sees bringing the entire Chinese groups under Chinese mainland control, whether it's Tibet, Hong Kong, and now the next big one is, the only one remaining is really Taiwan. That should be of great concern. And I really think the question would be, how much would he be deterred by seeing how the West kind of reacted to and the business community reacted to Ukraine? I think he might have some second thoughts. I don't know for sure. I think you can argue it two ways, but I think there's been a pretty massive effort to make Russia a pariah state, not in the entire world, but among many. And the question is, how long will it last? So I would think that President Xi might have some, he might have some questions about what would happen if he tried to invade Taiwan. I certainly think, I hope he would.
I hope so too. And elite politics in China is such a black box. It's so difficult to know exactly how the Politburo Standing Committee and leading generals are viewing the situation. We started this conversation talking about some of the issues of China beyond China. What happens in China doesn't just stay in China. And I'd like to pick up on some of those questions, because I feel like in the context of should nonprofits be in China, understanding what China is doing globally and how to push back on some of those negative elements is a really good way to do that. So I wonder, Mike, if you could give some examples of some of the research that you're doing or some of what you're seeing on Beijing's global footprint that you feel like is a good indication of the work that nonprofits can do on China outside of China.
Sure. No, thank you very much for that. Let me say a couple things. One thing that I would not give up on, Isaac, is getting accurate information in Chinese to the Chinese people. Like, we know there are VPNs in China. We know that there's a lot of content in the West that is consumed in China. Exactly how much, we don't know. But I do think it's very important not to give up on getting accurate information into China. And there are many different groups that are thinking about that. The US government is thinking about that. But I do think that that is a really important thing. And I do think that one thing that I was quite concerned about that happened during the Trump administration was when China, booted out all the correspondence for the big global newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, a number of others. That was a very hard blow to the cause of really transparency about what's happening inside China. I mean, you mentioned it, which I think is right, that the internal dynamics of the Chinese leadership is very hard, even if you have reporters there. But there's a lot of other things that are going on in China that are happening out there in plain sight, and we want to make sure that that is known. So that's number one. I think the second point I would make, Isaac, is compared to the Cold War period, China is much more active on the global stage, right? They are, for instance, trying to influence UN bodies. I'm always struck by the situation with respect to the Human Rights Council, where they're a member of the Human Rights Council, incredibly not. In fact, 17 or 18, about 1/3 of the 50 or so members of the Human Rights Council are authoritarian countries, or not free countries, as Freedom House labels them. And so I think China has been increasingly active in trying to shape the UN system to its liking. And I think they had a big success with the really unfortunate, I'm being nice here, the unfortunate trip of the Human Rights Commissioner to Xinjiang, which turned out to be a complete propaganda victory for the Chinese government. So I think that's something. I think an issue that we're very concerned about at Freedom House, I mentioned the transnational repression issue of China's efforts to kind of intimidate Chinese who are in the diaspora, to surveil and monitor and watch Chinese students who are studying abroad. I think that's a big issue. And I think another issue that we have been very concerned about at Freedom House is the way in which China is trying to shape the media ecosystem in other countries. That's something, we have a big report that will be coming out in the fall, headed by our wonderful China researcher, Sarah Cook, that's going to look at the role that China plays in shaping the media in more than 30 countries, or actually exactly 30 countries around the world. So I think that's a big difference between China now and, say, China before Tiananmen Square, during the Mao period. There were a lot of bad things that were happening inside China, but China did not, by and large, try to, or at least were not too effective in trying to shape the climate outside of China. That's much different now.
Great, great. So question from the audience, and a reminder that folks who are listening at home, as you have good questions, please feel free to send them in through the chat. So we discussed China in 2008 and the potential paths that China might have taken going forward. And you talked about how some of the assumptions people had back then were reasonable, despite the fact that they didn't come to pass. The future is impossible to predict. That said, how do you see the next 10 years or the next several years unfolding as it relates to China, specifically in regards to the issues that you work with in Freedom House?
Well, I certainly feel that if you look at our reports, both Freedom in the World, also we do another report called Freedom of the Net, which looks at freedom of online users. And that's actually something we haven't talked much about, but that's an area where China has actually been kind of a pioneer in terms of controlling the information that gets to Chinese people. So there was a quote that Bill Clinton made in the 90s. I'm not going to get it exactly right, but it's sort of directionally what he said. He said, China's not going to be able to really control the internet because it's going to be like nailing uh, Jello to the wall, and that's actually not proven to be the case. That China has this so-called Great China Firewall, has 2 million sensors, maybe more, and they have really been very successful in blocking accurate information from getting to the Chinese people. And now they are, in one of our reports we did several years ago, really stepping up efforts to export those tools of digital authoritarianism to other countries, which are they've been doing trainings for countries like Vietnam or other countries to help them learn how to better control the internet. So I think that the issue of human rights, freedom, democracy, these are going to be big issues going forward. I don't see things getting better for a while. I would just say that I tend to be sort of a hopeful person. And in general, I do think democratic change moves in waves. If you look at history, we're going now through a particular downturn, but I do think that in the long term, uh, people do not want to be controlled, and I think the human heart, the demand is for freedom. It's not a Western value. It's not a China. It's a global value, and I think I just look at what's happened in Taiwan, which has been one of the biggest freedom success stories over the last 30 years. That's a Chinese. Those are Chinese people, and they are now have one of the world's most thriving democracies after having a military dictatorship there after for a long time after the fall of the Kuomintang in the mainland in 1950. So I think I do feel hopeful in the long term, and I do think, again, I'm not a China expert, but when you talk to people who are expert on China, I think they often will emphasize this idea that you don't really know how brittle things are inside China from the outside, many of us. And so, uh, you know, Xi Jinping is under the same pressures that President Biden is. He has to deliver economic results. He has to deliver economic growth. He has to deliver, transparency, and corruption can be very corrosive. And you look at like what's happened in Shanghai with the COVID lockdowns over the last few months. I have to imagine that that is not making the Chinese government too popular right now among the Chinese people. So I think it's important not to lose hope. We have our own problems in our own country, of course, not anywhere near as severe as the problems in China. But I do feel hopeful in the long term, but I think we're for having some bumpiness going forward. I hope that's responsive to the question that was asked.
That's a fantastic answer, and I think that sets us up for what I'd like us to conclude on, which is we just looked at what the future may be. I'm wondering what you think the most helpful past analogy is. I mean, people will talk about the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. People will talk about the situation in Nazi Germany, possibly the 1930s in Germany with Hollywood, possibly with the situation in Xinjiang. People will talk about the concentration camps that the Germans had in Namibia in the earlier part of the 20th century, or the camps at the US border under the Trump administration, or the divestment movement, either against Israel or against South Africa in the 1980s. And I'm wondering if there's any of those comparisons that you found helpful in understanding and guiding Freedom House as it tries to untangle the situation with China, or if you feel like there's another framework that you like to use to think about US, China, and all of these really big issues.
It's a good question. I think historical analogies are really bad sometimes, although history sometimes rhymes. I certainly steer away from Hitler or Nazi analogies. I worked at the Holocaust Museum actually for many years, and those tend to be usually overstated. I think one issue that I would just sort of put on the table, well, let me say two things. They're a little bit different. I mean, one is that I think democracy is by definition a very fragile flower, if you will, and I think we should not take it for granted. It has to be struggled for, fought for, that it can be with us, and then in certain countries it can be lost, without really recognizing it. So I do think that history tells us that directionally we're moving in a good direction with respect to democracy and freedom, but we have to be really on our guard and vigilant to make sure that we are not taking it for granted. The other issue that I also have thought a lot about is the role of kind of corruption and the role of the news media. That it seems to me that one of the Achilles heels for authoritarian countries is the fact that if you kind of tend to look deeply into it, and I think Russia would be a good example, possibly China as well, you might know more about this, is that these authoritarian leaders tend to hold on to power by indulging or allowing a fair amount of state plunder, a fair amount of giving certain state assets to people who are very kind of politically well connected. And I think that eventually comes back to bite you, right? I think if Alexander Navalny has one issue that has kind of helped propel him, it's that he's really put a finger on the corruption that's basic to the Putin regime. And that is going to really create increasingly disaffection, I think, with the Russian people. And you're seeing this happen all over the world. So I think it says to me that a real strategy for combating authoritarian power ought to be really focusing on the exposure of corruption, the exposure of state capture, and really doing everything you can to help journalists, human rights defenders, anti-corruption activists, help them. They have to do it themselves, but they need support to expose what's going on.
Thank you, Mike. I think that was a great note to end on. I think this has been a fantastic guide on how to cover China and make change involving China as a nonprofit from outside of China. So really appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts and insights. And thanks, Carnegie Council, as always, for hosting this. Everyone, really appreciate you joining and listening.
Thanks a lot, Isaac. It was fun to be with you and appreciate the good questions.
Thanks, Mike. Take care. Have a good day.